After my husband announced his promotion, he slapped me at the party, ending his career. As I lay there on the cold marble floor of the Meridian Hotel ballroom, tasting blood and hearing the gasps of 400 stunned guests, I smiled because Theodore Sinclair had no idea that the woman he'd just humiliated in front of the entire pharmaceutical industry elite was about to destroy everything he'd spent 15 years building. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply revealing who you've always been to someone who never bothered to truly see you. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. The champagne glass shattered beside my head as Theodore's hand connected with my cheek, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent crystal ballroom like a gunshot. Around us, the celebration of his promotion to Chief Operating Officer of Apex Pharmaceuticals came to an abrupt halt. 400 of the most powerful people in the medical industry, board members, research directors, government officials, and media representatives, stood frozen in shock as they witnessed Theodore Sinclair, the newly minted COO, physically assault his wife during what should have been the pinnacle of his professional achievement. But as I touched my split lip and felt the warm trickle of blood, my smile only widened. Because there were 5 things Theodore didn't know as he stood there, his face flushed with rage and expensive scotch, his designer tuxedo perfectly pressed, his corporate mask finally slipping in front of everyone who mattered. First, that I wasn't just Evelyn Sinclair, the quiet research librarian he'd married for appearances and academic credentials. I was Dr. Evelyn Blackstone, as in Blackstone Medical Research Foundation, the organization that provided 40% of Apex Pharmaceuticals' research funding and held seats on their board of directors. The same foundation my grandmother had established, and that I now controlled through a carefully maintained trust that Theodore had never bothered to investigate. Second, that for the past 3 years I'd been conducting the most comprehensive investigation into pharmaceutical fraud and research misconduct in FDA history, building an airtight case that would send him to federal prison for decades. Every falsified clinical trial, every suppressed safety report, every bribed government official, I had documented it all with the precision of someone who understood both the science and the legal framework required to bring down an empire built on corruption. Third, that the woman watching from the head table wasn't just Dr. Adrienne Cole, Apex's newly appointed CEO, but someone who had survived her own abusive marriage to a powerful man who used his position to silence and control. Someone who had sworn she would never allow another woman to suffer what she had endured, and who now had both the authority and the personal motivation to deliver immediate and devastating justice. Fourth, that every conversation he'd had tonight, every boastful admission about cutting corners and manipulating data, had been recorded by surveillance equipment I'd positioned throughout the venue. The same advanced recording technology that my foundation used to document research protocols, now repurposed to capture a criminal's confession delivered to a room full of witnesses. And fifth, that this moment, this public humiliation and assault, wasn't an unfortunate accident or loss of control. It was the culmination of 3 years of methodical planning, strategic positioning, and psychological manipulation, designed to ensure that when Theodore finally revealed his true character, he would do so in front of every person capable of destroying his career, his freedom, and his legacy. The taste of blood mixed with the metallic fear I could see creeping into Theodore's eyes as he began to process the complete silence surrounding us. This wasn't the kind of awkward moment that corporate social events sometimes produced, quickly forgotten and smoothed over with polite conversation. This was the kind of career-ending catastrophe that would be replayed on news broadcasts, dissected in boardrooms, and referenced in ethics textbooks for decades to come. "Why are you smiling?" Theodore demanded, his voice cracking slightly as he realized that every phone in the room was now pointed in our direction. The guests weren't just witnessing a domestic dispute. They were documenting the complete destruction of one of the pharmaceutical industry's most promising executives. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I slowly pushed myself up from the marble floor, my emerald green gown, a custom design that had cost more than Theodore's monthly salary, though he'd never known where the money came from, spreading around me like liquid silk. I touched my split lip delicately, examining the blood on my fingertips with the clinical detachment of someone who had spent years analyzing far more disturbing evidence. Around us, the ballroom had erupted into chaos. Board members were pulling out phones, making urgent calls to legal departments and crisis management teams. Media representatives were activating recording equipment, sensing the kind of breaking news story that could define careers. Government officials were calculating the political implications of being associated with what was clearly about to become a major scandal. But my attention was focused entirely on Dr. Adrienne Cole as she stood from her seat at the head table, her expression transforming from shock to recognition to the kind of cold, calculated fury that preceded corporate executions. Adrienne had taken over as CEO just 6 months earlier, implementing zero-tolerance policies for harassment and fraud that had made her unpopular with old-guard executives like Theodore. What she was witnessing now would give her all the justification she needed to implement the kind of sweeping changes that would transform Apex Pharmaceuticals from a corrupt boys' club into an ethical research institution. This was the woman who would be making decisions about Theodore's future in the next 60 seconds. And, based on the way she was walking toward us with the decisive stride of someone who had been waiting her entire career for this exact moment, I knew that my 3 years of patient planning were about to pay dividends beyond my wildest expectations. The smile that had confused Theodore so much wasn't the expression of a victim. It was the smile of someone who had been playing chess while her opponent thought they were playing checkers. Someone who had spent 3 years positioning every piece on the board for this single, devastating move. Theodore Sinclair was about to learn that the quiet little wife he'd been dismissing and controlling was actually the most powerful person in the room. And that lesson was going to cost him everything he'd spent his entire career building. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. Alright, let's get back to it. The silence that followed my enigmatic smile stretched across the crystal ballroom like a living thing, heavy with unspoken questions and growing tension. Theodore stood frozen above me, his hand still raised from the slap, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and the first flickering shadows of genuine fear. Around us, 400 of the pharmaceutical industry's most powerful figures watched in stunned fascination as what should have been a celebration transformed into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. But it was my reaction that truly unsettled everyone in that opulent ballroom. Any reasonable person who had just been publicly humiliated and physically assaulted would be crying, cowering, or at the very least demanding help from the security guards who were already moving closer to our position. Instead, I remained perfectly calm, my smile growing wider as I dabbed at my split lip with a linen napkin someone had handed me, my eyes never leaving Theodore's increasingly panicked expression. "Evelyn," Theodore hissed, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper as he finally began to grasp the magnitude of his mistake. "Get up, stop this performance. You're embarrassing yourself and destroying my career." His words carried the same dismissive authority he'd used to control me for 5 years of marriage, the same tone that had convinced him he could manage this situation through intimidation and manipulation. What Theodore couldn't understand, what none of the witnesses could possibly comprehend, was that his career had been over long before his hand ever connected with my face. The slap wasn't the cause of his destruction. It was simply the final, perfect piece of evidence I needed to complete a case that would reshape the entire pharmaceutical industry's approach to research ethics and corporate accountability. I stood slowly, deliberately, my movements graceful despite the throbbing pain in my jaw. The emerald gown I'd chosen for tonight wasn't just a fashion statement. It was armor, designed to project confidence and authority at the exact moment when I would need both in abundance. Every detail of this evening had been orchestrated with the precision of a military operation, from the guest list, to the seating arrangements, to the specific timing of Theodore's inevitable breakdown. "Performance?" I repeated, my voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom with the kind of projection that came from years of presenting research findings to hostile audiences. "Theodore, darling, I haven't even begun to perform yet." The endearment rolled off my tongue with just enough irony to make several nearby guests exchange worried glances, sensing that something far more complex was unfolding than a simple domestic dispute. Dr. Adrienne Cole had reached the edge of our circle, her silver hair perfectly styled, her navy blue dress projecting both elegance and uncompromising authority. At 52, she had built her reputation on making difficult decisions quickly and implementing them without hesitation. The expression on her face suggested that she was already calculating the legal, financial, and public relations implications of what she'd witnessed, and none of those calculations were favorable to Theodore's future. "Mr. Sinclair," Dr. Cole said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute corporate authority, "I believe we need to discuss this situation immediately, in private." The emphasis on, quote, private, made it clear that she was offering Theodore one final opportunity to handle this crisis with some semblance of dignity, though her tone suggested she had little hope he would accept that offer gracefully. Theodore's response revealed everything about his character and his complete inability to read the room. Instead of accepting Dr. Cole's diplomatic intervention, he doubled down on the arrogance and aggression that had defined his management style for years. "Adrienne," he said, using her first name with the casual familiarity of someone who had never learned to respect authority when it came from a woman, "this is a private marital issue that has gotten out of hand. Evelyn has been under stress lately, and she's clearly having some kind of breakdown. There's no reason to let this minor incident impact company business." The collective intake of breath from the surrounding guests was audible. Theodore had just dismissed the physical assault of his wife as a minor incident, while suggesting that the victim was mentally unstable, and he'd done it in front of a CEO who had spent her entire career fighting exactly those kinds of dismissive, gaslighting tactics. But what made the moment truly extraordinary was my reaction. Instead of defending myself or breaking down under the public humiliation, I laughed. Not a bitter, hysterical sound, but a genuine expression of amusement that carried across the ballroom like music. The sound was so unexpected, so completely contrary to what anyone would expect from a woman who had just been assaulted and then publicly gaslit, that it seemed to freeze time itself. "Stress," I repeated, my voice rich with hidden meaning that Theodore was too obtuse to recognize. "Yes, Theodore. I suppose you could say I've been under a great deal of stress lately. The kind of stress that comes from documenting systematic fraud, research misconduct, and criminal conspiracy at the highest levels of pharmaceutical research." Each word was delivered with the precision of a surgeon making an incision, calculated to cause maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Theodore's face went pale as he processed my words. For the first time since I'd known him, he seemed to grasp that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship dynamic. The quiet, submissive wife who had supported his career for 5 years was speaking with the authority of someone who understood complex legal and scientific terminology, and more unsettling still, someone who seemed to have specific knowledge about criminal activities within the pharmaceutical industry. Dr. Cole stepped closer, her eyes sharp with the kind of focused attention that had made her one of the most successful executives in medical research. "Mrs. Sinclair," she said, using my married name, but with a tone that suggested she was beginning to suspect there might be more to my identity than anyone had realized. "Those are very serious allegations. Are you suggesting that you have evidence of criminal misconduct within our industry?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, creating a moment of perfect dramatic tension. Every person in that ballroom, board members, researchers, government officials, media representatives, was now listening with rapt attention, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a domestic dispute. They were present at the moment when years of carefully hidden corruption might finally be exposed. I looked directly at Dr. Cole, then let my gaze sweep across the faces of the most powerful people in pharmaceutical research, many of whom had unknowingly participated in or benefited from the crimes I'd been documenting. When I spoke, my voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who held all the cards in a game that others didn't even know they were playing. "Dr. Cole," I said, my smile returning with renewed intensity, "I don't just have evidence. I have enough documentation to restructure this entire industry's approach to research ethics and regulatory compliance. And Theodore here has just provided me with the final piece of evidence I needed to ensure that justice is served publicly, completely, and without any possibility of appeal." The mystery that had begun with my inexplicable smile was deepening into something that promised to reshape everything these people thought they knew about power, accountability, and the consequences of underestimating someone simply because they appeared powerless. The crystal ballroom of the Meridian Hotel had been transformed into a showcase of pharmaceutical industry power and prestige. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in midnight blue silk, each centerpiece featuring rare orchids that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. The guest list read like a who's who of medical research and corporate influence. Senior executives from every major pharmaceutical company, FDA officials, university research directors, venture capitalists who funded breakthrough treatments, and investigative journalists whose articles could make or break entire companies within days. This was Apex Pharmaceuticals' moment of triumph. After 15 years of aggressive expansion and strategic acquisitions, they had finally achieved their goal of becoming the third largest pharmaceutical company in North America. Tonight's celebration marked not just Theodore's promotion to Chief Operating Officer, but the company's announcement of their breakthrough arthritis treatment that promised to revolutionize pain management for millions of patients worldwide. What the celebrating guests didn't know was that the breakthrough treatment was built on falsified clinical trials, suppressed safety data, and bribed regulatory officials. What they couldn't possibly suspect was that the quiet woman who had just been assaulted by the guest of honor possessed enough evidence to bring down not just Theodore Sinclair, but the entire network of corruption that had made Apex's success possible. Theodore Sinclair had spent 15 years crafting his reputation as a brilliant research coordinator and strategic visionary. At 38, he possessed the kind of polished corporate charisma that impressed board members and intimidated subordinates in equal measure. His corner office at Apex headquarters was decorated with awards for research excellence, photos with politicians and celebrities, and framed articles from medical journals praising his innovative approaches to drug development and market penetration. But Theodore's real talent wasn't for research innovation, it was for systematic manipulation of the regulatory process that governed pharmaceutical approval. He had built his career on identifying promising research projects, then finding ways to accelerate their approval through strategic relationships with FDA officials, carefully managed clinical trial data, and aggressive suppression of any results that didn't support his predetermined conclusions. The arthritis treatment that was being celebrated tonight was Theodore's masterpiece of regulatory manipulation. The drug showed genuine promise in early trials, but also demonstrated concerning side effects that could cause liver damage in approximately 8% of patients. Rather than conducting additional safety studies or modifying the formulation, Theodore had chosen to bury the negative data while bribing key FDA reviewers to expedite approval based on incomplete information. Dr. Adrienne Cole represented everything that Theodore's old guard network feared about the changing pharmaceutical industry. At 52, she had built her reputation on rigorous research methodology and uncompromising ethical standards that had made her unpopular with executives who preferred profit margins over patient safety. Her appointment as CEO 6 months earlier had sent shockwaves through Apex's corporate culture, particularly among managers like Theodore, who had built their careers on cutting corners and manipulating regulatory oversight. Adrienne's personal history added layers of complexity to her professional motivations. She had survived a 15-year marriage to Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a renowned oncologist who had used his medical reputation to emotionally and financially control her while taking credit for research breakthroughs that she had actually developed. The divorce had been brutal, fought in both courtrooms and medical journals as Marcus attempted to destroy her professional credibility rather than accept financial settlements that reflected her actual contributions to their shared research success. But Adrienne had not just survived, she had thrived. She had used the settlement money to establish her own research foundation, then leveraged that success into consulting contracts with major pharmaceutical companies. Her expertise in identifying and preventing research fraud had made her invaluable to companies seeking to avoid regulatory scandals, eventually leading to her appointment as Apex's CEO, with a specific mandate to clean up their research practices and restore their reputation with federal oversight agencies. The other guests scattered throughout the ballroom represented the complex ecosystem of modern pharmaceutical development. Dr. Raymond Foster from the FDA's Drug Approval Division sat at table 12, his presence tonight a testament to the industry relationships that made expedited approvals possible. Victoria Nash, the investigative journalist from Pharmaceutical Weekly, circulated among the tables with the practiced ease of someone who had built her career on exposing industry corruption. Dr. Sarah Chen from Harvard Medical School's Research Ethics Board observed the celebration with the careful attention of someone whose recommendations could influence federal funding decisions. Each of these individuals would play crucial roles in the events that were about to unfold. Dr. Foster's presence provided credibility to Theodore's regulatory manipulation, but also meant that any revelations of misconduct would immediately trigger federal investigation. Victoria Nash's attendance ensured that whatever happened tonight would receive comprehensive media coverage within hours. Dr. Chen's observations would influence academic responses to any ethical violations that might be exposed. The ballroom itself had been chosen specifically for its symbolic value and practical advantages. The Meridian Hotel was known throughout the medical community as neutral ground, where competitors could network without appearing to collaborate inappropriately. The venue's advanced audio-visual systems, originally installed for medical conferences, provided perfect acoustics for ensuring that conversations could be heard clearly throughout the space. The multiple security cameras, designed to protect high-profile guests, would also document every moment of whatever drama might unfold. What none of the celebrating guests realized was that additional recording equipment had been strategically positioned throughout the venue by someone who understood exactly what kind of evidence would be needed to prosecute pharmaceutical fraud at the federal level. Hidden microphones with law enforcement-grade recording capability were embedded in the floral arrangements, providing coverage that would satisfy legal requirements for electronic surveillance evidence. The timing of tonight's celebration had been carefully orchestrated to maximize both the symbolic impact and the legal consequences of any revelations that might emerge. Tomorrow morning, FDA officials were scheduled to announce final approval of Theodore's arthritis treatment, making tonight the last opportunity to prevent a dangerous drug from reaching patients. The presence of media representatives ensured that any allegations of misconduct would receive immediate public attention, while the gathering of industry leaders meant that professional consequences would be swift and decisive. As I stood in that ballroom, blood still fresh on my lip from Theodore's slap, I surveyed the landscape of power and influence that had enabled his crimes for so many years. These were the people who had turned medical research into a profit-driven enterprise, where patient safety was secondary to shareholder returns. These were the regulators, journalists, and academics whose complicity had made systematic fraud possible. But they were also the people who would serve as witnesses when Theodore's empire of corruption finally collapsed. Every powerful individual in that room would remember this night as the moment when pharmaceutical industry arrogance finally met its match in the form of someone who understood both the science and the legal framework necessary to deliver justice. The stage was set, the players were positioned, and the audience was watching with growing fascination as they began to realize that the evening's entertainment was far from over. The moment had arrived to begin peeling back the layers of deception that had defined my relationship with Theodore for 5 years. As I stood in that ballroom, surrounded by the most powerful figures in pharmaceutical research, I could see the confusion and growing panic in Theodore's eyes, as he tried to reconcile the submissive wife he thought he knew with the confident, authoritative woman who was systematically dismantling his understanding of reality. But the truth was far more complex and devastating than anyone in that room could possibly imagine. There weren't just 1 or 2 secrets I had been hiding from Theodore. There were layers of deception that went to the very foundation of our marriage, my identity, and the power dynamics that govern the pharmaceutical industry itself. "Theodore," I said, my voice carrying the kind of clinical precision that comes from years of presenting research findings to hostile audiences. "Before we continue this conversation, I think it's important that everyone here understands exactly who they're dealing with." I reached into my evening clutch and withdrew not just my phone, but a set of credentials that Theodore had never seen before. Credentials that would explain everything about my inexplicable confidence and specialized knowledge. Dr. Adrienne Cole stepped closer, her experienced eye immediately recognizing the significance of official documentation in a situation that was clearly escalating beyond a simple domestic dispute. The other guests pressed forward as well, sensing that they were about to witness something far more substantial than marital drama. My name, I announced, holding up the first credential for everyone to see, is Dr. Evelyn Blackstone, not Evelyn Sinclair, not the research librarian that Theodore introduced to his colleagues, but Dr. Evelyn Blackstone, Director of Pharmaceutical Ethics and Oversight for the Blackstone Medical Research Foundation. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was immediate and significant. Everyone in pharmaceutical research knew the Blackstone Foundation as one of the most influential oversight organizations in the industry. Theodore's face went from pale to ashen as he processed this revelation. The Blackstone Foundation wasn't just another research organization. It was the institution that provided funding recommendations to federal agencies, conducted independent safety reviews of controversial treatments, and maintained the database of pharmaceutical industry violations that could make or break companies seeking regulatory approval. But I wasn't finished. The second thing you need to understand, I continued, withdrawing another set of documents, is that for the past 3 years, I haven't just been Theodore's wife. I've been conducting the most comprehensive investigation into pharmaceutical fraud and regulatory manipulation in FDA history, working directly with federal prosecutors to build cases against executives who prioritize profits over patient safety. The silence that followed this announcement was deafening. Around us, phones were appearing as guests began to grasp the implications of what they were witnessing. Dr. Raymond Foster from the FDA looked like a man who had just realized he might be standing next to his own prosecution witness. Victoria Nash from Pharmaceutical Weekly had her recording equipment out, clearly recognizing that she was witnessing the beginning of the biggest pharmaceutical scandal in decades. "Investigation?" Theodore stammered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "You're a librarian, you organize research papers and attend faculty meetings. You don't have the expertise or authority to investigate anything." His dismissive response revealed everything about his fundamental inability to see women as capable of complex strategic thinking, the same blindness that had made my investigation possible. I smiled, withdrawing the third and most damaging piece of documentation from my clutch. "Actually, Theodore, my credentials are quite extensive. Harvard Medical School, doctorate in pharmaceutical biochemistry with a specialty in toxicology and regulatory compliance. MIT graduate program in forensic accounting and corporate fraud investigation. Federal certification as an expert witness in pharmaceutical litigation cases." Each credential landed like a physical blow, systematically destroying Theodore's understanding of who I was and what I was capable of. Dr. Adrienne Cole's expression had transformed from professional concern to fascination as she processed the implications of my qualifications. "Dr. Blackstone," she said, using my real name with the respect due to someone whose expertise she clearly recognized. "Are you suggesting that you've been conducting an undercover investigation into pharmaceutical industry practices?" "Not suggesting," I replied, withdrawing my phone and accessing files that contained 3 years of meticulously gathered evidence, confirming. "The Blackstone Foundation has been working with federal prosecutors to investigate systematic fraud, regulatory manipulation, and safety violations across multiple pharmaceutical companies. Theodore's activities at Apex have been a primary focus of that investigation." The fourth revelation was the one that would truly terrify Theodore and everyone else who had participated in the corruption network. "The arthritis treatment that you're all celebrating tonight," I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, "is built on falsified clinical trial data, suppressed safety reports, and systematic bribery of federal regulatory officials. The liver damage risks that Theodore buried in his research would affect approximately 8% of patients. That's roughly 400,000 people if the drug reaches full market distribution." Theodore's legs seemed to give out as he sank into a nearby chair, the full scope of his exposure finally penetrating his arrogance-clouded mind. He wasn't just facing professional embarrassment or career setbacks. He was looking at federal criminal charges for endangering hundreds of thousands of lives while systematically corrupting the regulatory process designed to protect public health. But the fifth and most devastating truth was still to come. "The reason I know these details so precisely," I continued, scrolling through files on my phone that contained audio recordings, financial documents, and photographic evidence, "is that Theodore has been confessing his crimes to me for 3 years. Every fraudulent approval, every bribed official, every suppressed safety report. He's documented it all, in conversations with the wife he thought was too simple to understand the implications of what he was telling her. I turned the phone screen toward the gathered crowd, displaying audio files with dates, times, and transcript summaries that painted a comprehensive picture of pharmaceutical industry corruption. Spousal conversations aren't privileged when they involve ongoing crimes against third parties, I explained, addressing the legal question that several attorneys in the crowd were undoubtedly considering. Everything Theodore told me about endangering patients and bribing federal officials is fully admissible evidence in federal criminal proceedings. Dr. Foster from the FDA had gone completely pale, clearly calculating his own exposure and liability as someone whose approval decisions might have been influenced by Theodore's systematic bribery campaign. Victoria Nash was frantically taking notes, recognizing that she was witnessing the exposure of a scandal that would reshape pharmaceutical industry oversight for decades. The final piece of the revelation involved the scope and timing of the investigation. Tomorrow morning, I announced, federal prosecutors will be unsealing indictments against 17 pharmaceutical executives, 12 regulatory officials, and 6 university research directors who participated in Theodore's corruption network. The evidence package includes financial records, audio recordings, photographic documentation, and testimony from 43 witnesses who have been cooperating with federal investigators. Theodore looked around the ballroom with the desperate expression of someone searching for escape routes that didn't exist. Every powerful person in that room now knew that he was facing federal prosecution for crimes that could result in decades in prison. More importantly, they understood that associating with him carried enormous risk of guilt by association and regulatory retaliation. The truth that I had hidden for 3 years was finally revealed. Theodore Sinclair hadn't just married a quiet research librarian who would support his career ambitions. He had married the federal investigator who would bring down his entire criminal enterprise, confessing his crimes to the very person who was building the case that would destroy him completely. The power dynamic in that ballroom had shifted permanently and irreversibly, and Theodore was just beginning to understand that everything he thought he knew about his life, his marriage, and his future had been an elaborate illusion maintained by someone who possessed far more authority and expertise than he had ever bothered to discover. As I watched Theodore's world crumble in real time, I knew the gathered executives and officials needed to understand how we had arrived at this moment. The truth about our marriage, my investigation, and his systematic corruption didn't begin with tonight's celebration. It started 5 years ago with a chance encounter that Theodore had orchestrated, and that I had allowed him to believe he was controlling. It was September 2019, at the International Conference on Pharmaceutical Innovation in Denver. I was there, representing the Blackstone Foundation, presenting research on regulatory compliance failures that had led to patient deaths in the previous decade. Theodore was attending as Apex's Director of Research Coordination, already building the reputation that would eventually lead to his promotion to Chief Operating Officer. What Theodore saw that day was Dr. Evelyn Blackstone delivering a presentation that could potentially impact Apex's regulatory standing. What he calculated, with the cold strategic thinking that defined his approach to everything, was that marrying the Blackstone Foundation's Director of Ethics and Oversight would give him inside access to regulatory decisions and advance warning of any investigations that might threaten his carefully constructed criminal enterprise. But what Theodore never bothered to investigate was my personal history, my motivations, or the sophisticated surveillance capabilities that the Blackstone Foundation had developed over decades of pharmaceutical oversight work. He saw an opportunity to manipulate someone he considered professionally useful, but intellectually manageable. I saw an opportunity to get close to someone whose research practices had been flagged by multiple sources as potentially fraudulent. The courtship that followed was a masterclass in mutual deception, though only I understood the true scope of what was happening. Theodore pursued me with the focused intensity of someone executing a business strategy. Expensive dinners at restaurants where pharmaceutical executives networked, weekend trips to medical conferences where he could introduce me to key contacts, carefully staged romantic gestures that always seemed to coincide with important regulatory deadlines or funding decisions. I allowed myself to be courted because Theodore represented everything that was wrong with modern pharmaceutical research. His approach to drug development prioritized speed and profit margins over patient safety. His relationships with regulatory officials crossed ethical boundaries that should have triggered federal investigation. His management style silenced legitimate safety concerns through intimidation and professional retaliation. 6 months into our relationship, Theodore made his first major mistake. During a weekend trip to Martha's Vineyard, after several glasses of expensive wine, he began bragging about his innovative approaches to regulatory approval. What he described as creative problem-solving was actually systematic fraud. Clinical trials designed to hide negative results, safety data buried in technical appendices that regulators rarely examined thoroughly, and strategic relationships with FDA officials that involved financial incentives disguised as consulting fees. I listened with the fascination of someone who specialized in pharmaceutical ethics violations, mentally cataloging each admission while maintaining the expression of an impressed girlfriend who didn't fully understand the technical implications of what she was hearing. Theodore's need to demonstrate his professional sophistication to someone he was trying to impress had led him to confess crimes that could result in decades in federal prison. That night, as Theodore slept beside me in our luxury hotel suite, I made the decision that would define the next 5 years of my life. I would marry Theodore Sinclair, not because I loved him, but because positioning myself as his wife would give me unprecedented access to the kind of evidence that federal prosecutors needed to dismantle pharmaceutical industry corruption at the highest levels. The Blackstone Foundation had been investigating regulatory violations for decades, but always from the outside, limited by corporate confidentiality protections and the sophisticated legal barriers that pharmaceutical companies use to hide their criminal activities. Theodore was offering me something that no amount of traditional investigation could provide: access to the inner workings of systematic fraud from someone who believed I was his ally rather than his investigator. Our wedding 18 months later was featured in Pharmaceutical Industry Weekly as a union between regulatory oversight and industry innovation. The irony was exquisite. Theodore had married the person who would ultimately destroy his career, and the industry publication had framed it as a positive development for pharmaceutical research ethics. But the real investigation began during our honeymoon in Switzerland. While Theodore attended meetings with European pharmaceutical executives, I established the secure communication networks and evidence storage systems that would be necessary for a long-term undercover operation. The Blackstone Foundation's cybersecurity team helped me create encrypted databases that could store audio recordings, financial documents, and photographic evidence without any possibility of Theodore discovering my activities. The pattern that emerged over our first year of marriage was both predictable and horrifying. Theodore's success at Apex was entirely dependent on his willingness to endanger patient safety for corporate profit. The breakthrough treatments that had built his reputation were rushed to market through falsified safety data, bribed regulatory approvals, and systematic suppression of legitimate scientific concerns about long-term health risks. But Theodore's most revealing characteristic was his pathological need to demonstrate his professional superiority to the wife he considered intellectually inferior. He would come home from meetings where he had orchestrated regulatory fraud and describe his activities in detail, confident that I lacked the expertise to understand the criminal implications of what he was telling me. Every conversation became evidence. Every boastful admission was recorded and transcribed. Every financial document he carelessly left around our home was photographed and analyzed. Theodore's arrogance and dismissive attitude toward my capabilities made him the perfect target for an investigation that required complete access to confidential information. The turning point came 18 months into our marriage, when Theodore began describing his plans for the arthritis treatment that would become his masterpiece of regulatory manipulation. The drug showed genuine promise in early trials, but also demonstrated liver toxicity risks that could affect hundreds of thousands of patients if the treatment reached full market distribution. Rather than conducting additional safety studies or modifying the formulation to reduce toxicity risks, Theodore chose to bury the negative data while accelerating the approval process through systematic bribery of key FDA officials. He described his strategy to me in detail, confident that his wife would admire his business acumen rather than recognize his willingness to sacrifice patient safety for career advancement. That night, as I listened to Theodore plan what amounted to mass poisoning disguised as medical breakthrough, I contacted federal prosecutors and formally offered to serve as an undercover witness in a comprehensive investigation of pharmaceutical industry corruption. The evidence I had already gathered was sufficient to justify federal surveillance authorization, and my position as Theodore's wife provided legal cover for recording conversations and documenting activities that would otherwise require complex warrant procedures. The investigation that began with Theodore's arrogant confessions would eventually expand to include 17 pharmaceutical executives, 12 regulatory officials, and 6 university research directors who had participated in his corruption network. But at its heart, the case remained focused on the man who had been so confident in his intellectual superiority that he had spent 3 years confessing federal crimes to the federal investigator who was building the case against him. Standing in that ballroom, watching Theodore finally understand the scope of his exposure, I realized that his downfall had been inevitable from the moment he decided that marrying me would advance his criminal career. His inability to see women as capable of complex strategic thinking had made him the perfect target for an investigation that required him to believe he was in control, while systematically destroying himself through his own admissions. Once I committed to the long-term investigation of Theodore and his criminal network, every aspect of my daily life became a carefully orchestrated operation designed to gather evidence while maintaining perfect cover as the devoted pharmaceutical wife. The methodical approach I developed over 3 years would ultimately produce the most comprehensive documentation of pharmaceutical fraud in federal law enforcement history. My mornings began at 4:30 a.m., 2 hours before Theodore's alarm, with secure communications to my handler at the FBI's white-collar crime division. Agent Rebecca Torres had been assigned to coordinate the pharmaceutical fraud investigation, and our daily briefings covered everything from Theodore's planned activities to strategic objectives for evidence gathering. These conversations took place through encrypted voice-over internet protocols that left no trace on our home's communication systems. The Blackstone Foundation had provided me with surveillance equipment that would have impressed intelligence agencies. My wedding ring contained a microphone capable of recording conversations with broadcast-quality clarity. The expensive handbag that Theodore had given me for our first anniversary housed a digital recording system that could capture 8 hours of audio while simultaneously transmitting real-time transcripts to secure FBI servers. Even my prescription glasses had been modified with micro cameras that could photograph documents without any visible indication of recording activity. But the most sophisticated element of my surveillance operation was the way I transformed our home into a comprehensive evidence collection facility. The home office that Theodore used for confidential pharmaceutical business had been equipped with audio and video recording systems that activated automatically whenever he accessed his computer or made phone calls. The dining room where he entertained colleagues and clients became a stage where pharmaceutical executives unknowingly confessed their crimes while enjoying expensive wine and believing they were among trusted allies. Theodore's systematic underestimation of my intelligence made the evidence gathering almost effortless. He would leave confidential documents scattered across his desk, never imagining that his librarian wife possessed the expertise to understand complex financial structures or recognize the regulatory violations documented in clinical trial reports. He would take phone calls about bribery and fraud while I prepared dinner in the adjacent kitchen, assuming that I was too focused on domestic tasks to comprehend the criminal implications of his conversations. The financial documentation proved to be the most damaging evidence against Theodore's network. Using forensic accounting techniques I had learned during my MIT graduate program, I traced money flows through shell companies, consulting agreements, and research grants that revealed the systematic corruption of FDA approval processes. Theodore's personal banking records, which I accessed through our joint financial accounts, showed payments from pharmaceutical companies that corresponded exactly with favorable regulatory decisions that defied scientific evidence about drug safety. But gathering the evidence was only half of the strategic challenge. The more complex task was building relationships with Theodore's criminal associates in ways that would encourage them to make admissions that could be used in federal prosecutions. The pharmaceutical industry's social culture provided perfect opportunities for this kind of intelligence gathering, as executives regularly attended conferences, charity events, and dinner parties, where alcohol and professional camaraderie lowered their guard against potentially incriminating statements. I became the perfect pharmaceutical wife, charming enough to put Theodore's colleagues at ease, intelligent enough to ask questions that seemed like genuine interest rather than interrogation, and skilled enough to guide conversations toward topics that would produce legally admissible evidence. At the annual Pharmaceutical Research Association Gala, I spent 2 hours listening to Dr. Marcus Webb from the FDA describe how Theodore's consulting payments had influenced his approval decisions for drugs that failed standard safety protocols. The charity fundraiser for childhood cancer research became an opportunity to document how university researchers were falsifying clinical trial data in exchange for continued funding from Theodore's network. Professor Linda Hayes from Johns Hopkins spent an entire evening describing how her team had manipulated patient selection criteria and statistical analysis methods to hide evidence that Theodore's arthritis treatment caused liver damage in pediatric test subjects. My strategy for managing Theodore himself required the most delicate psychological manipulation. I had to maintain his confidence in his intellectual superiority, while gradually encouraging him to reveal more damaging information about his criminal activities. The technique I developed involved expressing admiration for his business acumen while asking seemingly naive questions that prompted him to explain his methods in detail. How do you manage to get drugs approved so much faster than your competitors? I would ask over dinner, maintaining the expression of a wife who admired her husband's professional success. Theodore's response would inevitably involve detailed descriptions of bribery, data manipulation, and regulatory fraud that provided perfect evidence for federal prosecutors, while feeding his ego and reinforcing his belief that I was too simple to understand the criminal implications of what he was describing. The most challenging aspect of the investigation was maintaining my emotional equilibrium while documenting crimes that endangered hundreds of thousands of patients. Every falsified safety report Theodore described represented real people who would suffer liver damage, cardiac complications, or death because pharmaceutical profits were prioritized over scientific integrity. Every bribed FDA official meant that dangerous drugs would reach market while safe treatments were delayed by bureaucratic obstacles. But I channeled that moral outrage into motivation for building the strongest possible case against Theodore's entire network. Federal prosecutors had explained that pharmaceutical fraud cases often failed because executives were protected by corporate legal structures and regulatory complexity that made criminal intent difficult to prove. My evidence-gathering strategy was designed to eliminate those protections by documenting clear admissions of criminal intent, along with financial records and scientific data that proved systematic fraud. The breakthrough moment came during Theodore's preparation for tonight's celebration, when he began bragging about how his arthritis treatment would generate billions in revenue, despite safety risks that he had deliberately concealed from regulatory review. His detailed explanation of the data manipulation techniques and bribery strategies he had used provided the final pieces of evidence that federal prosecutors needed to pursue RICO charges against his entire criminal organization. By the time we arrived at the Meridian Hotel tonight, I possessed 3 years of comprehensive evidence that would support federal prosecutions against 17 pharmaceutical executives, 12 regulatory officials, and 6 university researchers who had participated in Theodore's corruption network. The surveillance equipment I was wearing would capture his final confessions and document the assault that would provide additional charges while demonstrating his character to judges and juries. The strategic response I had developed to Theodore's criminal behavior wasn't just about gathering evidence. It was about ensuring that his arrogance and dismissive attitude toward women would ultimately become the tools of his own destruction. Every conversation he thought demonstrated his intellectual superiority had actually documented his criminal liability. Every document he carelessly left accessible had become evidence in his federal prosecution. Every colleague he had trusted with incriminating information had unknowingly provided testimony that would ensure his conviction. Standing in that ballroom, watching Theodore finally understand that his simple wife had been the architect of his downfall, I realized that 3 years of methodical preparation had created the perfect trap. His belief in his own brilliance and his fundamental inability to respect women's intellectual capabilities had made him the ideal target for an investigation that required complete access to confidential information, combined with detailed documentation of criminal intent. As my investigation into Theodore's pharmaceutical fraud deepened, I began to uncover a web of corruption that extended far beyond one man's criminal ambitions. What had started as documentation of regulatory manipulation and safety data suppression had evolved into exposure of a systematic conspiracy that threatened the integrity of medical research across multiple institutions and endangered millions of patients worldwide. The first expansion of scope came through Theodore's relationship with Dr. Patricia Vance, Chief Medical Officer at Meridian University's teaching hospital. During a dinner party at our home in March 2022, Dr. Vance had consumed enough wine to begin describing how she manipulated clinical trial protocols to guarantee favorable outcomes for pharmaceutical sponsors. Her techniques included patient selection criteria designed to exclude individuals likely to experience adverse reactions, statistical analysis methods that minimize the appearance of safety concerns, and strategic timing of data collection periods to avoid capturing long-term side effects. But Dr. Vance's admissions revealed something far more disturbing than individual research misconduct. She described a coordinated network of university medical centers that were systematically falsifying clinical trial data in exchange for continued pharmaceutical industry funding. The conspiracy involved 12 major teaching hospitals, 37 research directors, and hundreds of clinical trials that had produced fraudulent safety data for drugs currently being prescribed to millions of patients. The scope of patient endangerment was staggering. The diabetes medication that Theodore's network had rushed to market through falsified trials was causing kidney failure in approximately 12% of patients, roughly 240,000 individuals who were suffering organ damage because critical safety data had been deliberately concealed from regulatory review. The blood pressure treatment that had been approved based on manipulated clinical trial results was triggering cardiac arrhythmias that had already contributed to over 800 documented deaths. Theodore's arthritis treatment, the crown jewel of his fraudulent career, represented the most dangerous example of systematic safety data suppression. The liver toxicity risks that he had buried in technical appendices weren't just affecting the 8% of patients that initial trials had identified. Follow-up studies that I had accessed through Blackstone Foundation connections showed that long-term exposure was causing irreversible liver damage in nearly 20% of patients, with fatal complications occurring in approximately 2% of cases. The mathematical implications were horrifying. If Theodore's arthritis treatment reached the projected market penetration of 5 million patients annually, his decision to conceal safety data would result in approximately 100,000 cases of serious liver damage and 10,000 preventable deaths each year. The regulatory approval he was celebrating tonight wasn't just a career milestone. It was a death sentence for thousands of patients who trusted that FDA approval meant their medications were safe. But the human cost of pharmaceutical fraud extended beyond direct patient harm to include the systematic destruction of legitimate medical research. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, whose groundbreaking work on autoimmune disorders had been suppressed because it contradicted Theodore's fraudulent arthritis research, had been forced to abandon 15 years of potentially life-saving studies when her funding was terminated through pharmaceutical industry pressure. Her research could have led to treatments that helped millions of patients without the devastating side effects that Theodore's fraud had concealed. The corruption network had also targeted Dr. James Rivera, whose epidemiological studies had identified patterns of organ damage associated with drugs that Theodore's network was promoting. Rather than addressing the safety concerns that Dr. Rivera's research had documented, pharmaceutical executives had collaborated with university administrators to revoke his tenure, destroy his professional reputation, and ensure that his findings never reached regulatory review or public awareness. The scope of regulatory capture was equally disturbing. Through my investigation, I had documented how Theodore's criminal network had systematically corrupted FDA approval processes by placing pharmaceutical industry allies in key regulatory positions. Dr. Michael Foster, who had approved 17 drugs despite clear evidence of safety violations, had received over $2.3 million in consulting fees from pharmaceutical companies whose products he was supposed to regulate objectively. But the regulatory corruption extended beyond individual officials to include systematic manipulation of the approval process itself. Theodore's network had developed sophisticated methods for timing drug applications to coincide with periods when regulatory oversight was minimized. exploiting procedural loopholes that allowed dangerous drugs to reach market without comprehensive safety review, and coordinating media campaigns that pressured regulators to expedite approvals for treatments that hadn't completed proper testing protocols. The international implications of Theodore's criminal network were equally concerning. Through partnerships with pharmaceutical companies in 12 countries, his fraud techniques were being exported globally, creating safety risks for patients worldwide while undermining international confidence in American pharmaceutical research standards. The European Medicines Agency had begun questioning FDA approval decisions because of concerning patterns they had identified in clinical trial data from American research institutions. Perhaps most disturbing was the systematic targeting of vulnerable patient populations for dangerous experimental treatments. Theodore's network had specifically focused on developing drugs for rare diseases and pediatric conditions because regulatory oversight was less rigorous, and patient advocacy groups were more likely to support expedited approval processes. Children suffering from juvenile arthritis were being prescribed Theodore's toxic treatment based on clinical trials that had deliberately excluded patients most likely to experience liver damage. The economic dimensions of the fraud were equally staggering. Theodore's criminal network had generated over $47 billion in pharmaceutical revenue through drugs that should never have received regulatory approval. The healthcare costs associated with treating complications from fraudulent medications, liver transplants for arthritis patients, cardiac procedures for individuals harmed by blood pressure medications, dialysis for diabetes patients with drug-induced kidney failure, were estimated to exceed $23 billion annually. But the broader economic impact included the systematic suppression of legitimate pharmaceutical innovation. Companies developing safer, more effective treatments were being driven out of business by competitors who could offer lower prices and faster market penetration, because they weren't investing in proper safety testing or regulatory compliance. Theodore's fraud wasn't just endangering current patients. It was distorting market incentives in ways that would compromise pharmaceutical safety for decades. The investigation had also revealed how pharmaceutical fraud was undermining public confidence in medical research and regulatory institutions. Patient advocacy groups were beginning to question FDA approval processes. Medical professionals were expressing concerns about prescribing newly approved medications, and international partners were reconsidering their reliance on American pharmaceutical safety standards. Standing in that ballroom, surrounded by the very people who had enabled and profited from systematic pharmaceutical fraud, I realized that tonight's confrontation wasn't just about Theodore's individual crimes. It was about exposing a conspiracy that had corrupted medical research, endangered millions of patients, and undermined the scientific integrity that formed the foundation of modern healthcare. The evidence I had gathered over 3 years didn't just document one man's criminal career. It provided the foundation for comprehensive reform of pharmaceutical regulation, clinical trial oversight, and industry accountability measures that would prevent future tragedies while ensuring that medical research served patients rather than corporate profits. Theodore's assault tonight would catalyze changes that extended far beyond his individual prosecution, to include systematic reforms that would restore integrity to pharmaceutical research and rebuild public confidence in the institutions designed to protect patient safety. The orchestration of tonight's confrontation had begun 6 months earlier, when federal prosecutors informed me that they had sufficient evidence to proceed with indictments against Theodore's criminal network. The challenge was ensuring that his arrest and prosecution would generate maximum public impact, while preventing any possibility of evidence destruction or witness intimidation. Agent Rebecca Torres and I developed a strategy that would use Theodore's own arrogance and need for public recognition as the weapons of his destruction. The selection of tonight's celebration as the venue for Theodore's downfall was strategically perfect. The annual Apex Pharmaceuticals Gala celebrating his promotion to Chief Operating Officer would bring together every person whose opinion could destroy his career, while creating an environment where his violent tendencies would be most likely to surface under pressure. Federal surveillance teams had spent weeks studying the Meridian Hotel's ballroom layout, identifying optimal positions for recording equipment and escape routes for civilian safety. My role in orchestrating the guest list had been crucial to ensuring that the right witnesses would be present when Theodore's criminal network was exposed. Through my position on the Blackstone Foundation board, I had influenced invitation decisions that brought together the most influential figures in pharmaceutical regulation, medical research, and investigative journalism. Each attendee had been selected based on their ability to either validate the evidence against Theodore or ensure that his crimes received immediate media coverage and regulatory response. Dr. Adrienne Cole's presence was essential because her authority as Apex's CEO gave her the power to terminate Theodore immediately while protecting the company from association with his crimes. But more importantly, her personal history of surviving an abusive marriage meant that witnessing Theodore's assault would trigger immediate and decisive action based on both professional duty and personal conviction. Federal behavioral analysts had confirmed that Dr. Cole's psychological profile indicated she would respond to domestic violence with swift and uncompromising intervention. The positioning of media representatives throughout the ballroom had been coordinated with federal prosecutors to ensure comprehensive documentation of Theodore's confession and assault. Victoria Nash from Pharmaceutical Weekly had been briefed by FBI media relations specialists about the significance of tonight's events, though she remained unaware of the specific timeline or my role in the investigation. Her presence would guarantee that Theodore's crimes received front-page coverage in the industry publication that shaped professional reputations. Dr. Raymond Foster's attendance created the perfect psychological pressure point for Theodore's breakdown. As the FDA official whose approval decisions had been influenced by Theodore's systematic bribery, Dr. Foster's presence would serve as a constant reminder of the criminal liability that Theodore was trying to conceal. Federal agents had positioned surveillance equipment to capture any interactions between Theodore and Dr. Foster that might provide additional evidence of regulatory corruption. The advanced recording systems that had been installed throughout the venue exceeded anything that had been used in previous federal sting operations. Military-grade directional microphones were embedded in the crystal chandeliers, providing coverage that could isolate individual conversations from background noise with broadcast-quality clarity. The floral arrangements contained fiber optic cameras capable of capturing facial expressions and document details that would be crucial for jury presentations. But the most sophisticated element of the surveillance operation was the real-time analysis system that federal cybersecurity specialists had developed specifically for this investigation. Every conversation Theodore had tonight was being transcribed instantly using advanced speech recognition software, then analyzed by artificial intelligence programs designed to identify admissions of criminal intent or attempts to obstruct justice. My personal surveillance equipment had been upgraded for tonight's confrontation with technology that would impress intelligence agencies. The diamond necklace that Theodore had given me for our anniversary contained recording devices that could capture conversations occurring up to 30 feet away while transmitting real-time audio feeds to FBI monitoring stations. The elegant clutch purse I carried housed a comprehensive communications system that allowed me to coordinate with federal agents positioned throughout the hotel. The psychological manipulation strategy I had developed for tonight required precise timing and emotional calibration. Federal behavioral specialists had helped me identify the specific triggers that would provoke Theodore's most violent reactions, while ensuring that his breakdown occurred in front of the maximum number of witnesses. The key was challenging his intellectual superiority and professional competence in ways that would escalate his aggression beyond his ability to maintain his public facade. The sequence of revelations had been carefully planned to maximize Theodore's psychological pressure while building toward his inevitable assault. Each disclosure about my true identity and the scope of the federal investigation was designed to increase his desperation while eliminating any possibility of damage control or strategic retreat. By the time I revealed that federal prosecutors were unsealing indictments tomorrow morning, Theodore would be facing complete professional destruction with no escape routes available. The legal framework for tonight's operation had been established through months of coordination between federal prosecutors, FBI surveillance specialists, and pharmaceutical industry regulators. Every recording device, every witness statement, and every piece of evidence gathered tonight would be admissible in federal court, under statutes specifically designed to prosecute white-collar crime and public corruption. The assault that federal analysts predicted would occur would provide additional charges while demonstrating Theodore's character to judges and juries. Dr. Sarah Chen's presence as a representative of Harvard Medical School's Research Ethics Board would ensure that Theodore's academic credentials and professional associations would be immediately revoked following tonight's revelations. The pharmaceutical industry's professional certification organizations had been briefed about the scope of the investigation and were prepared to implement immediate sanctions against anyone identified as participating in Theodore's criminal network. The international coordination that had been established for tonight's operation reflected the global scope of pharmaceutical fraud that Theodore's network had enabled. Regulatory agencies in 17 countries had been briefed about the evidence that would be revealed tonight and were prepared to implement immediate import restrictions and safety reviews for drugs that had been approved through Theodore's fraudulent processes. The timing of tonight's confrontation had been coordinated with federal prosecutors to maximize the impact on Theodore's criminal network while preventing any possibility of evidence destruction or witness intimidation. Simultaneous raids on pharmaceutical companies, university research facilities, and regulatory offices were scheduled for tomorrow morning, using the evidence gathered tonight to justify comprehensive search warrants and arrest orders. The strategic positioning of federal agents throughout the Meridian Hotel created multiple layers of protection for civilian safety while ensuring comprehensive evidence collection. Plainclothes agents disguised as hotel staff, pharmaceutical executives, and media representatives were prepared to intervene if Theodore's violence escalated beyond verbal threats and simple assault. As I stood in that ballroom, wearing surveillance equipment worth more than most people's annual salaries and surrounded by federal agents posing as pharmaceutical industry guests, I realized that 3 years of meticulous planning had created the perfect trap. Theodore's need for public recognition and professional validation had led him directly into a situation where his crimes would be exposed to everyone capable of destroying his career, while his violent reaction would be documented for federal prosecution. The chess game that had begun with our first meeting in Denver was approaching its endgame, with every piece positioned for Theodore's complete and irreversible destruction, through his own arrogance and inability to recognize that the woman he had married to advance his criminal career was actually the federal agent who would bring down his entire network. The aftermath of Theodore's assault unfolded with the swift precision of a federal operation that had been years in the making. Within minutes of his hand connecting with my face, the Meridian Hotel ballroom had transformed from a pharmaceutical industry celebration into the epicenter of the largest medical fraud prosecution in American history. Dr. Adrienne Cole's response was immediate and decisive. "Security," she commanded, her voice cutting through the stunned silence with the authority of someone who had waited her entire career for this moment. "Detain Mr. Sinclair pending police arrival." "Mr. Sinclair, you are terminated from Apex Pharmaceuticals effective immediately for assault against a board member and systematic criminal conduct that has endangered public health." Theodore's face cycled through disbelief, panic, and finally desperate rage as he realized that his career was ending in front of everyone who mattered in pharmaceutical research. "This is insane," he stammered, looking around the ballroom for support that would never come. "Adrienne, you can't seriously believe these ridiculous allegations. Evelyn is obviously having some kind of breakdown." But the industry executives who had been laughing at Theodore's jokes just hours earlier were now backing away, calculating their own exposure and liability. In corporate America, being associated with scandal was almost as dangerous as being the cause of it. Theodore's professional network was abandoning him in real time, each distancing gesture another nail in his career coffin. Federal agents who had been positioned throughout the ballroom, disguised as hotel staff and pharmaceutical executives, began converging on our location with practiced efficiency. Agent Rebecca Torres, whom Theodore had unknowingly chatted with earlier while she posed as a medical device sales representative, approached with credentials that identified her as FBI Pharmaceutical Fraud Division. "Theodore Sinclair," Agent Torres announced, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of federal officials, endangering public safety, and assault of a federal witness." The Miranda rights that followed were delivered to a man whose understanding of reality was crumbling with each word. The evidence presentation that had been coordinated for this moment was a masterpiece of federal prosecution strategy. Agent Torres produced tablet computers displaying financial records, audio transcripts, and photographic evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of pharmaceutical industry corruption spanning multiple companies and regulatory agencies. Each document Theodore was shown contained his own admissions, his own signature, his own recorded voice describing crimes that would result in decades in federal prison. Victoria Nash from Pharmaceutical Weekly was frantically documenting everything, her experienced journalist's instincts recognizing that she was witnessing the exposure of a scandal that would reshape industry regulation for decades. The photographs and recordings she captured would be front-page news across every major publication by morning, ensuring that Theodore's crimes received the public attention necessary to prevent similar corruption in the future. Dr. Raymond Foster from the FDA had gone completely pale, clearly calculating his own exposure as someone whose approval decisions had been influenced by Theodore's systematic bribery. His panicked phone calls to legal counsel were being recorded as additional evidence of the regulatory corruption that had enabled dangerous drugs to reach patients without proper safety review. But the most satisfying aspect of Theodore's destruction was watching him finally understand that his simple wife had been the architect of his downfall. 3 years of dismissive comments about my intelligence, 3 years of casual revelations about his criminal activities, 3 years of arrogant confidence that I was too naive to understand the implications of what he was describing. All of it had been carefully documented and strategically used to build the case that would destroy him completely. "You've been recording me," Theodore said, his voice cracking with the horror of complete betrayal. "Our entire marriage has been a lie." The irony was perfect. Theodore was accusing me of deception while standing in handcuffs after being arrested for crimes against hundreds of thousands of patients. "Our marriage was built on your belief that I was intellectually inferior," I replied, watching federal agents secure the evidence that would reshape pharmaceutical regulation. "I simply allowed you to continue believing something that made you comfortable while documenting the crimes you were committing against people who trusted that FDA approval meant their medications were safe." The coordinated arrests that began within hours of Theodore's detention demonstrated the comprehensive scope of the federal investigation that his assault had triggered. By dawn, 17 pharmaceutical executives, 12 regulatory officials, and 6 university research directors were in federal custody, charged with conspiracy, fraud, and endangering public safety through systematic corruption of medical research and drug approval processes. The media coverage was immediate and devastating. Theodore's assault on his wife during a pharmaceutical industry celebration became the human interest angle that made complex regulatory fraud accessible to general audiences. The image of a powerful pharmaceutical executive physically attacking the federal investigator who had exposed his crimes provided a perfect metaphor for industry arrogance and the abuse of corporate power. But the long-term impact extended far beyond individual prosecutions to include comprehensive reform of pharmaceutical regulation and research oversight. The evidence that Theodore's network had generated through their arrogant admissions provided federal lawmakers with the documentation necessary to implement sweeping changes to FDA approval processes, clinical trial supervision, and industry accountability measures. 6 months later, I stood in the same ballroom where Theodore had destroyed his career, this time addressing the International Conference on Pharmaceutical Ethics and Reform. The Meridian Hotel had become a symbol of the transformation that was reshaping medical research, and my presentation on investigative methodology was being attended by federal prosecutors, regulatory officials, and pharmaceutical executives who were committed to ensuring that systematic corruption would never again endanger patient safety. Theodore Sinclair was serving a 23-year federal prison sentence at a minimum security facility in Ohio, his pharmaceutical career permanently ended, and his professional reputation serving as a cautionary tale about the consequences of prioritizing profits over patient safety. The arthritis treatment that he had planned to celebrate tonight had been withdrawn from market after independent safety reviews confirmed the liver toxicity risks that he had concealed from regulatory approval. Dr. Adrienne Cole had been promoted to chairman of Apex Pharmaceuticals' board of directors, implementing research ethics programs that were being adopted as industry standards by pharmaceutical companies worldwide. Her zero-tolerance approach to regulatory compliance and systematic prevention of research misconduct had restored investor confidence while establishing Apex as a leader in pharmaceutical integrity. The Blackstone Medical Research Foundation had expanded its oversight activities to include real-time monitoring of clinical trial data and systematic review of regulatory approval processes that would prevent future corruption while ensuring that legitimate medical innovations could reach patients safely and efficiently. As I concluded my presentation to an audience of pharmaceutical leaders who were committed to reform rather than fraud, I realized that Theodore's assault had catalyzed changes that extended far beyond his individual prosecution. The systematic corruption that had endangered millions of patients was being replaced by oversight mechanisms that would restore public confidence in pharmaceutical research, while ensuring that medical innovation served patients rather than corporate profits. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishing individual criminals, it's about transforming entire systems to prevent future crimes while rebuilding the trust that makes medical progress possible. Theodore's inability to see women as capable of complex strategic thinking had become the foundation for reforms that would protect countless future patients from the kind of systematic fraud that his arrogance had made possible. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.